Sir, so with reference to S. Chaudhry's quote, we can see that in what has even been a criticism of the Constitution, but as in a fact, a merit of it, that
Uh,
the Indian Constitution does not derive from one single source and it is not confined to a single strand of even Indian traditional political thought or
hmm,
social ideology. It
hmm,
borrows from a myriad of streams of progressivism and thought, not restricted just to India itself, but
hmm,
even European thinkers. And it allows for the inclusion of every idea that the makers believed would be
hmm.
beneficial
Correct.
for India's progress.
Correct. And so very nicely put. And that's when, so what I was explaining to them is that if any one of these statements come as a comment or critically discussed as a 15 marker, the rest of the lines will go as the substantiating arguments. Because what you want to say has been explained by Mehta later on is what does it mean by a cosmopolitanism? It means that the Constitution of India is sitting at the cross currents of global constitutional law, which we'll see later on. So, this is what cosmopolitanism is all about, that the Constitution would serve Indian needs. It would not be bound by any particular tradition. It would rather reflect and be in service of a global conversation on law and values. So, the Indian nationalist movement was self conscious about the need to transcend nationalism. So look at the broad mindedness of our nationalist leaders, that while they were nationalists, they were equally observant about the rival political ideas. That's why the socialists could coexist with nationalists. So it was not a narrow nationalism. It was it that nationalism encoded in it had the realization that nationalism or nationalist political ideology will have to take a backseat once we get the independence. That is only going to take us as far as we are not sovereign and independent. After that, the rest of the political ideas will take a front seat. So you can see that it is not a peculiar aspect of our constitution, but it is a legacy of the nationalist movement, because nationalist movement also had diverse political ideologies, in some cases even rival ones. So because it was the nationalist movement which had the cosmopolitan understanding, our constitution itself became cosmopolitan.
He want to say that before the in period of the colonialism there is a many बहुत ज़्यादा exclusion of the marginal class. There is very disparity towards the women and everyone. So he want to say by this that his main aim of the constitution main aim is to uproot the all the economical disparities of the social exclusion, and he want to make a empower the marginalized class. For example, we can take example of untouchability. uh,
Right. So, Anushka, while talking about transformative constitution, you are only focusing on social transformation, and that too very limited to the caste system. But social transformation goes into not just the caste based, but also gender based, correct? So, that is social. But then you have economic transformation, a colonial economy to a post colonial economy. It goes into political as well. This is why I've included the later line also, because not merely a legal document, but a transformative tool aimed at radically, drastically altering the social, economic, and political fabric of the country. So, universal adult franchise becomes the first pillar of political radical transformation. When people say India was not a nation, India is a state and then becomes a nation. But you can use the principle of UAF to alter that logic. Had India not been a nation, we would not have accepted universal adult franchise. Probably that was the fraternity because of which no one questioned why we are giving UAF to everyone. At least not the mainstream political thought. Never questioned this. So that shows the radical transformation of Indian society, where political equality became a norm rather than an exception. We modified it with x plus delta x or x minus delta x, or maybe we modified x so much that it stopped looking like x. So while we were motivated by the idea of bill of rights, which are on the basis of individualism, we modified the individualistic idea of rights for the communitarian society. We re-engineered rights to give group rights, which was never the idea of rights on the basis of group solidarity rights. That is not a modification. That is like a reinvention. That is a discovery. So when we were about to decide the relationship between state and religion, in no way we were motivated by the Western idea. We recreated the new secularism, and it was so different from the then understood meaning of secularism that we did not even use that word in the entire constitution, because it was not secularism. Its principles, its genesis, its context was entirely different from the Western world. It was not thought like the child of Protestantism. It was the child of Indian society, a very different understanding of secularism. So you can see, you take a principle and you show the modification. The idea of equality, how we combined the two very different principles of equality. The British understanding of color blind vision of equality and American understanding of color conscious understanding of equality. One that does not look into background realities, one that is very conscious of background realities, equal protection of the laws. So everywhere you can see the modifications. So how can you see it as copy paste? Two good values already exist. Why should we not use them for our benefit? So you can see that the Ambedkar's point is correct. Everywhere we can see the modifications. Is this clear to everyone? Okay. Then you should go on and now start reading these, and let's explain to each other what these commentaries mean. Let's first go through the commentaries on Constitution of India. Okay. So Mr. Chaudhary says what made Indian Constitution distinctive was its self-consciously cosmopolitan character. Am I audible and visible to all of you?
Yes, sir.
Emmanuel, please
Yes,
turn on your
sir.
camera. Shubhi, Preeti, Emmanuel, why are you guys not here? Emmanuel?
हाँ सर, थोड़े पर्सनल रीजंस आ गए, थोड़ा काम पे, घर पे काम आ गया थोड़ा.
Acha. And what about you, Preeti?
I will come tomorrow, sir.
Okay. Other people, please turn on your cameras. Shashwat, Shubham, Anushka. All right. So we have been doing other parts of PSIR. Today we will start with the IGP, and I'm not going to discuss each and every line of the syllabus. We'll just directly start delivering things that matter for this examination, and that is by directly start covering the first line of the syllabus. Correct? All of us are writing mains, and largely we have a clear-cut understanding of what the lines of the syllabus entail. Correct? So if you look into all the lines of the syllabus, largely there is a lot of similarity between GS paper 2. So that is one of the reasons that we have taken PSIR maybe. Also beyond that, the similarities end just there, because although the crux of the matter remains the same, but the way the answer has to be reproduced is very different. Correct? The basic idea is to put forward the answer and every point in paper 1 part B by quoting some of the other scholars. The more number of scholars we can manage, the better it is. And that is why even before we could begin the class, I have sent you the class notes. Correct? So if you open it, whatever perspectives that we are going to deal today, they are already included in the PPTs that have been shared with you guys. Correct? So that is largely going to be the material. Now, over period of next 2.5 hours, the idea is to understand all the scholarly opinions, understand what each and every argument stands for, so that when we memorize it, we know where to use it. Correct. So largely in the paper one, part A, part B, first line of the syllabus, making of Indian constitution has to be broken down, because when the constitution was being made, correct, unlike most of the pre-colonial constitutions that were being written, which were the result of a revolution, Indian constitution and the writing of the Indian constitution became sort of first exercise in the post-colonial world to come up with a new constitutional text. Correct. But the subtle difference was that we were not fortunate enough, or maybe we did not go through a revolution. Correct. And so most of the scholars have seen the constitution writing as an effort to give rise to a revolution through a text, rather than a text that is a result of a revolution. What that was the case for all the constitutions that have been written earlier. Correct. So when you look at the making of the Indian constitution, the first idea is to scrutinize and put to the scrutiny the Constituent Assembly itself. So there were various remarks that were made with respect to the Constituent Assembly as to it is not representative because of various reasons that we will see. It was not a legitimate authority to frame the Constitution of India for various reasons that we will see. And now we have the advantage of hindsight, 75 years, to basically criticize all those commentaries and have a better perspective on what is the real nature, or what was the real nature of the Constituent Assembly was. Was it really an illegitimate, unrepresentative body? The idea to criticize the Constituent Assembly of a newly independent nation is to say that because the Constituent Assembly is illegitimate, because the Constituent Assembly itself is unrepresentative in character, the constitution that it is going to give rise to will be un-Indian or maybe anti-Indian. Because how can people who are not even representative of Indians can write the Constitution of India, which will work for Indians? Correct. So these are the perspectives which will go in understanding of the topic of making of Indian Constitution one angle with respect to the Constituent Assembly and the debates around the Constituent Assembly. The second perspective is to look into the perspective of the Constitution itself. Because when the Constitution was being formalized, immediately the people could see the features of the Constitution of India. They could see what has been sourced from where. Even though Google didn't exist, people had the data in their mind and they could see these are the provisions we have read somewhere. And then when they went back to the libraries, they could see, okay, part 3 has been sourced from there. Article 21 seems to be motivated from this particular provision. Okay, we have read this kind of provision somewhere. And so people could increasingly see and map various provisions to make the commentaries which were very pejorative and derogatory. Correct. So the idea is to talk about them, then to display the notes. Online people will have to go to the respective PPTs. We were not able to share the screen. That's why the class got delayed. Offline people can read it from here, right at the back. Okay, it's visible to everyone. Probably online people can also read this font size. So what I've done is that I have gathered all the maximum possible set of scholarly opinion that will be useful, which will enable you not only to write good answers in this line of the syllabus, later on, as you will see, it will be highly relevant for the remaining line of the syllabus as well. Okay, is this clear to everyone? All right. So let's quickly start and set the ground for what was the basis of the criticism of the Constituent Assembly itself. Online people, am I audible? Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
sir.
All right. So when you look at the Constituent Assembly and the way it came into existence, all of us know that the process that was followed to create the Constituent Assembly itself was very questionable process of creation. Correct. Generally, what happens is that there is a freedom struggle, violent or peaceful, generally violent, and then it creates few leaders. And after the country gains independence, sovereignty, these are the people who generally are supposed to have the will of the people, and that's when they come together to write the Constitution of India. So nowhere in the world generally the Constituent Assembly is put through direct elections. But in India, we did not have any revolution. And the Constituent Assembly, when it came into existence, it came through a very, very shady process which had roots in the British Parliament. So the principles of the Constituent Assembly were laid down in Independence of India Act. And the formula was through Cabinet Mission Plan, both of them British in nature. So the question was, the seeds of the Constituent Assembly were sown by the Britishers. Does that sound like a very credible criticism of Constituent Assembly? Of course it is. How can a Constituent Assembly be legitimate to write the constitution for the sovereign country if itself is not sovereign in character? But the criticism go beyond the basic formation. When you look at the composition and the way people were chosen itself had the violation of various basic principles of democratic representation. When we look at some of the basic principles of democratic representation, few fundamental principles should never be ignored. One of them happens to be the mandate. Mandate is very important in any representation. What does mandate means? No. When you go to cast your vote in the election, you should have a very clear-cut idea as to the person who will get elected, what will be the job of that person. Mandate differentiates the voting patterns. So for example, people of Delhi, when they went to vote for legislative assembly elections, they voted for a particular party because it was clear this was to elect Delhi government, or people for Delhi legislative assembly. However, the same set of electorate returned a very different outcome when they went for Lok Sabha elections. All seats going to BJP and all seats going to Aam Aadmi Party. That is what mandate does to the electoral decisions. In Constituent Assembly, when the Constituent Assembly was being created, not only it was not put to the direct election, so that was violated. So the direct elections did not happen. Even when the indirect elections to choose the members, you look at the electorate. The electorate consisted of the then existing members of the provincial legislative assemblies. When these provincial legislative assembly members were chosen, they were not given the mandate to become the electorate for Constituent Assembly. In 1945 and 1946, am I visible and audible to all of you? Online people? Because my camera has frozen.
So the video is frozen.
You are not.
Is it?
Sir, you're audible, but the screen is.
The screen is frozen. Why has the screen?
Now it's fine.
No, you're fine now.
Am I fine now? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So the members of the Provincial Legislative Assembly were chosen in 1945. And when they were chosen, the task was to make laws for the matters of state list according to GOI 1935. But suddenly, Indian Independence Act laid down a section to say that the members of the Constituent Assembly will be chosen by the sitting provincial legislative assembly members. This is a violation of mandate. People did not vote them to power to elect the members of Constituent Assembly. So you confuse the mandate. Imagine you go to vote for MLAs and suddenly they become MPs. You will feel cheated. मैंने तुम्हें चुना ही नहीं था इस काम के लिए. Correct? And so that was also one of the fundamental flaws that went into creation of a very, very unrepresentative Constituent Assembly. However, there is another important factor that goes into election apart from the manner of election and mandate, was the fact of franchise. Why universal adult franchise has become such an important pillar that unless and until you have UAF, the state is not truly democratic, even procedurally, is because by manipulating the franchise, you can manipulate outcome of an election. Just a quick poll. If only upper castes are allowed to vote in our country, which party will have 400 par? Or will there be any problem in a single party to clear 400? No, because by manipulating the franchise, you manipulate the outcome of the elections. Look at the very limited franchise that was given to the people in India at that point of time. The franchise was limited on the basis of income, property, and education. All those people who had income, property, and education under a colonial rule were basically extended arm of the colonial state. How could you acquire wealth in a colonial state if you are not supporting them? Is there any possibility that you have a land above a particular cutoff and you are not a zamindar? And if you are a zamindar, you have been given the legal right to collect the tax, which means you are pro-British. So the entire electorate was pro-British. Striking right at the core of the Constituent Assembly, forming the biggest criticism of the Constituent Assembly was the manner of elections.
Sir, did we have representation from the princely states?
So that is added on criticism.
The nominated, right?
That is
they're
added on
unelected.
criticism, that which I was about to come later on, that some members were not even indirectly elected. They were representatives of the princely states, around 73 members. So how can such an unrepresentative body, पूछना है कुछ? So that is for later. Yeah. So you can see that there were unelected people also as a part of the Constituent Assembly. So you can see that Constituent Assembly took a lot of time to concretize the final text, which was put finally. Later on, when people started observing that the Constitution of India is being amended so frequently. So for example, the first constitutional amendment was all about cutting down the most important provision of the Constitution of India, Part 3, reinforce this criticism. हमने तो पहले ही बोला था ये रिप्रेजेंटेटिव नहीं है. देखो 2 महीने में कौन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन अमेंड करता है यार. So it did not take the first parliament even 2 months to bring the first constitutional amendment. This is what happens when you create unrepresentative and illegitimate body to frame constitution. And then it was followed through by successive constitutional amendments every year. By 1972, you barely had 22 years of constitution and you were tabling 42nd constitutional amendment, which meant on an average 2 constitutional amendments per annum, as compared to American Constitution, which was amended only 22 times, by that time 220 years old, which means as opposed to American Constitution, which was being amended on an average 1 single time per decade, Indian Constitution was being amended twice every year. Adding to the substance, or adding on to the criticism that probably Constituent Assembly was not representative, because had it been representative, you would not need to amend the Constitution as often. It's making sense to everyone? Also, an idea was proposed in the Constituent Assembly, क्योंकि उनके पीठ पीछे उनकी बुराई हो रही थी, तो उनको तो पता चल ही रहा था, छुप छुप के ये बातें हो रही कि ये हम लोग सही काम नहीं कर रहे. So they started thinking about putting the constitution on referendum, which is a very, very credible way, so that if you ignore certain procedures, eventually if the public approves by and large majority of the people of the country through universal adult franchise, if they go and then they approve it by majority, then all the problems can be taken care of. कि भाई ये तो भाई जनता ने वोट किया था. And then you will have the authority to start the Constitution of India as we the people of India. Only when you have exposed the Constitution to all the people, we the people of India. So the question has always remained who we the people is. I don't think any of our grandfathers have signed any text that legitimized the Constitution of India. Does that make sense to everyone? So while these were very valid criticisms of the Constituent Assembly, then you had even more fierce criticism, which can be objectively demonstrated on paper with respect to the provisions of the constitution. People started framing very, very, you can say, people started writing works, voluminous works, on why the Constitution of India is going to fail for Indian society. They could see foreign imprints in the Constitution. So, for instance, just a basic GS level knowledge, we know that the core of administrative structure has been sourced from Government of India Act. So the imprints of the Government of India Act were clearly visible, 1935. So the entire federal structure has been sourced from there. Largely the parliamentary system has been sourced from Government of India Act 1935. Apart from going beyond Government of India Act 1935, we could clearly see other inspirations. जो हमारे म्यूजिक कंपोजर्स कहते हैं ना, it is not copy, it is an inspiration. So the inspirations could be clearly seen littered around in the Constitution of India. No person shall be deprived of life or personal liberty is exactly from American Constitution. In fact, this until the second draft, it said no person shall be deprived of life or personal liberty except for due process of law. Exactly taken from American constitutionalism. Equal protection of laws from American constitutionalism. The mechanisms of centralizing tendency taken from Canada. The goals and objectives that are sought to be achieved under and through democratic constitutional means, DPSP, sourced from Irish constitution. So all of these things became very, very obvious and made it very difficult for the people who are working hard for the project. So probably Nehru, when he used to, when he would visit the parliament building, which also acted as a constituent assembly building, he must be scared कि कब कोई कान में चिल्ला के कह दे ओए copy. Because now it was becoming increasingly difficult. So you can see what were the sources and motivations, which led people to make all sorts of commentaries, which are very, very important for us to memorize word by word verbatim. Okay, so let's look at those commentaries. People, please open, and then we will come back to PYQs to see. Wait a second. So read these commentaries. K. Hanumantaya, a member of the Constituent Assembly, commented, we wanted the music of Veena or Sitar, but here we have the music of English band. ज़्यादा emotional नहीं हो गए? Chishi, third page of the PPT manual. Anushka? Yeah, on the same page. हाँ आशीष नहीं भेजा उसको रेफरेंडम के लिए, उसके भी हम आते हैं, क्यों नहीं? रेफरेंडम भेजना इम्पॉसिबल था उस टाइम पे. तुम बैकग्राउंड देखो ना, किस बैकग्राउंड में तुम रेफरेंडम भेज रहे हो? रास्ते में कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन की कॉपी जला देंगे लोग. सोशल फैब्रिक पूरा डिस्ट्रॉयड था. इनफैक्ट इंडिया एक टेरिटरी भी नहीं था उस टाइम पे, है ना? तो अगर उस समय की प्रायोरिटीज देखो ना, तो पहला प्रायोरिटी क्या होगा? कंसोलिडेशन एंड एस्टैब्लिशमेंट ऑफ ऑर्डर. तब तो कोई काम होगा. रेफरेंडम कराने के लिए भी तो एक इंडिपेंडेंट रेफरेंडम कंडक्ट एजेंसी चाहिए होगी. कैसे कराओगे रेफरेंडम? तो इलेक्शन कमीशन था ही नहीं उस टाइम पे. नहीं तो फिर रेफरेंडम पे लोग क्वेश्चन उठाने लगेंगे, अरे ये तो नेहरू ने बस अपने घर में करवा लिया रेफरेंडम. So the basis that is used to criticize the Constituent Assembly, the same basis will be used to criticize the referendum process also, and then we will be locked in that vicious cycle. So you can see that whenever there will be a question on the Constituent Assembly, you will have to produce both the sides of the coin. So one side of the coin is people raising questions. So the first question that was raised is that we gathered here for Indian classical music show, and what we have got is music of an English orchestra. That was because our constitution makers were educated that way. So because you were all barristers, from Oxford and Cambridge, obviously that has gone into tilting the India's constitutional writing in a certain way, like a hegemony. The second one is Loknath Mishra, who said that it is not only a slavish imitation of the West, क्योंकि imitation में तो Loknath Mishra would be cool, but what he's not cool about is that it is a slavish surrender to the West. The second line. Process each and every line. This is not a foundation class. So the idea is to give you notes and do less of board work. There will be no dictation in IGP. Just the notes will be given, right? Chishi, what do you mean by the second statement, slavish surrender to the West, rather than just an imitation?
Sir, in terms of the outlook of the Constitution itself, right? It focused almost completely on Western sort of ideals of as in the preamble itself, it says liberty, justice, liberty, and equality and fraternity. None of which is modern ideas had originated in India, right?
Yeah, correct. Justice, equality, and liberty. None of them are Indian in nature. And that is what essentially Pratap Bhanu Mehta say. Apart from, along with Madhav Khosla, is to be free does not mean to be bound by a particular social contract, which we'll see. Just because we are Indians, we are not going to create a constitution which will say the state shall provide inequality or the state shall not give you liberty. Just because Indian society does not believe in liberty and equality doesn't mean that we are going to perpetuate that. The task of the Constitution of India is to put the most ancient society on a path to modernity. So the modern values had to be incorporated, irrespective of whether they were domestic, indigenous, Indian or not. Correct? Lakshmi Narayan Sahu says that the ideals on which this draft is framed have no manifest relation to the fundamental spirit of India. This constitution would not prove suitable and would break down soon after being brought into operation. Behind all these critiques or criticisms, there is one underlying thread to denote two very specific. So if you collect all the commentaries which criticize the Indian Constitution or the Constituent Assembly, they can be segregated into two very specific key terms that you have to use and in while writing the answers. One of them is that the Constitution of India is a derivative eclecticism. What does it mean by derivative eclecticism? Derivative eclecticism means that, so what is derivative? It is derived. Derivative. And eclectic means it is a mixture. So it is like Haldiram Bhujia, where you cannot see aloo bhujia clearly, you cannot see. So there are 10 different kinds of namkeens which have been mixed together. So it might taste good, but it is, so that was the idea, that it is random mixture of Western values derived from the foreign sources. One of the criticisms, because you can see the derivation here and there and there. This is derived mixture. So this is one part of the criticism, but rest of the criticisms of Indian Constitution, at least the initial ones, can be labeled as that because it is a derived mixture from Western values, it is unfit for Indian society. And that is a more serious charge. Because now you are creating the supreme law of the land. And if it is unfit for Indian society, if it is un-Indian, how will it going, how is it going to provide so much of that has been claimed? If the understanding of the Constitution If the understanding within the constitution of the Indian society is not correct, the constitution will always be distant from the Indian society. And because it will always be distant, it will not be able to touch all the people who are desirous of justice. And that is the second part, to say that it is an un-Indian constitution. In fact, few people went as far as to say it is, forget about it is an un-Indian, it was anti-Indian. And what was their ground of saying it is an anti-Indian constitution? So to say that it is un-Indian, we can see that you have some credible proof for that. But to say that it is anti-Indian takes a lot of courage to say it. काफी बेशरम होना पड़ेगा आपको. So how would you say that? That is an anti-Indian constitution. It was an anti-Indian constitution because it expelled the core belief of Gandhian principles to the unenforceable section of the constitution. So a person who epitomizes the Indian nation, a person who has understood the Indian society so well, if his core belief, decentralization of power, finds no place in the mandatory provision of the constitution, instead relegated to Article 40 in DPSP, which by the way is not enforceable, will it just be un-Indian? Or people were right in saying it is anti-Indian? Because if that is the constitution of India, it cannot put Gandhian core principle to that position. And if it has done that, it is an anti-Indian constitution. So these are largely the critiques of the Constitution of India and the Constituent Assembly. If you have any doubts, so Shashwat.
सर इस क्रिटिसिज्म का सेम क्रिटिसिज्म नहीं यूज हो सकता जो अर्लियर क्रिटिसिज्म था कि गांधीयन बिलीफ्स को भी मतलब कभी एज सच एक इलेक्टोरल प्रोसेस से पब्लिक सैंक्शन नहीं मिला कि उनको एज अ गिवन हम लोग कोर इंडियन प्रिंसिपल मान ले.
नहीं, इलेक्टोरल सैंक्शन तो नहीं मिला, लेकिन if I ask you a very, very simple question, when do you really think the nationalist movement acquired a extremist turn where it was able to connect more and more number of masses? So when did it really become a mass movement? So if I have to give you dates, you will obviously pick that date which falls between 1915 and 1920. So the arrival of the Gandhi is a watershed movement in India's nationalist movement. At least that is what the mainstream understanding of India's nationalist movement tells us. So we are not going into historical perspectives like an history optional that there are people who question the Congress hegemony, and then, but if you believe if that is something we agree that the story that we have been told is true, then under that framework, Gandhi was the turning point. So whether it is dual membership, whether it is non-violence, if you go back, you can see Gandhi was very astutely, wisely designing the strategies as a means to incorporate more and more diverse sections with antagonistic class interest on the same platform. So nowhere in the world a social nationalist movement, a social movement, has been able to devise a strategy where industrial workers sit on the same platform as capitalists. शाणपंथी देखो आप गांधी की, बिरला के घर में रुक के बिरला की फैक्ट्री में स्ट्राइक खत्म करवाने जाते थे वो, ये भाई का स्वैग था. So this style of resolution of class conflict, आप सोच सकते हो वहां वो प्रोटेस्ट कर रहे हैं बिरला के अगेंस्ट, और ये ट्रेन से आ रहे हैं बिरला की कोठी में रुकने, और फिर वहां से जा रहे हैं कि नहीं नहीं ये देखो मैं तो सीधी सीधी बात करने वाला आदमी हूँ. So you can see that the peasants and zamindars sitting on the same platform. So that's why this alignment was what made India really, it gave India, Indian movement, Indian nationalist movement, a very massy character. So you can see that un-Indian or anti-Indian is one thing, and these criticisms on paper look to be extremely credible, correct? Until the point you have people writing modern commentaries, they go back, and when they scrutinize these commentaries, now because they have the advantage of hindsight, now we know these commentaries have not turned out to be true, correct? So the number one counter argument to all these commentaries is that, sorry to say, Constitution of India has survived. So because it has survived, it can't be anti-Indian, it can't be un-Indian also, because it has survived, right? So that is the bottom line. How can an un-Indian constitution survive for 75 years? So that right now we are in 2025. So it is 75 plus years that the Constitution of India has survived. And this is the common theme which has been used by Pratap Bhanu Mehta, Rajiv Bhargav, Madhav Khosla, Shudipto Adhikari, all these scholars. And they analyze the same theme from different points of view, which we will see now. Okay. All these commentaries have been taken largely from the Oxford, the Constitution of India, that was published in 2021. So if you go, initial 4 chapters are dedicated largely to the same commentaries. So the chapter has been finalized and reviewed by Pratap Bhanu Mehta, but that chapter has been contributed by 5 different scholars, where their earlier published articles in different journals, they have contributed from there, right? So they have already written articles, which when Pratap Bhanu Mehta was writing this book, a very good book for India's constitution, he has taken help from these scholars, and he has taken permission to publish their quotations from their earlier published journals, papers in journals. Okay, so let's first come to this point, and let's see whether any other alternative was available or not. So when Churchill said that it is an assembly of Brahmins, or when people said that it is a one-party assembly in one-party country, it was made in the backdrop of communism. So the idea was to say that although the Congress party claims itself to be believing in democratic principles, but it is no different from its neighbor, China, where again you see a single party. So it is a single party monopoly. So one party assembly in a one party country is to say India is a communist or communist-like country, where multi-party system ideologies are not allowed. So we are moving towards authoritarianism established by a single party, ruled by few people. Correct? But Pratap Bhanu Mehta wrote an article in Indian Express last year, 75 years of the Constitution of India coming into effect, the point that he had already made in his book. So basically, when you read their editorials, largely they have already written those, and Indian Express people call them ki bhai ek naya article chahiye aapka. So they copy paste the earlier published article and it gets published as an editorial with minor changes. So what he said is, oftentimes what we see is that rather than the lack of elections, the procedure through which you conduct the election create the major problems. So not having an election sometimes is a better option. Now go back to 1947 and see what was going on in India. India was passing through one of the worst communal violence. So the communal polarization was already at peak, correct? Secondly, India was not one common continuous territory. So for example, do you think Bihar, UP? So in fact, on 16th of August, Rajasthan was not under the part of India, because Rajasthan was, the entire Rajasthan except for High Commissioner of Ajmer was under the different princely rules. So they had not signed the treaty, right? So except for the island of Ajmer, the entirety of what constitutes Rajasthan today was not the part of the territory of India. Hyderabad obviously became the part of India much later, Kashmir much later, entire Northeast much later, Junagadh and other princely states. in that kind of a perforated territory, how will you conduct elections and on whom you will conduct the elections? So again, if you would have conducted elections, then you would say, अरे ये तो limited franchise है, तो that is a territorially limited franchise. क्योंकि कौन वोट करेगा फिर? यूपी के कुछ लोग, बिहार के कुछ लोग, बंगाल के कुछ लोग, बाकी लोग कैसे वोट करेंगे? क्योंकि वो तो आपके पार्टी नहीं है उस टाइम पे. Number one. Secondly, for elections to give credible results, you always need credible election conducting agency. And the framers of the constitution were very, very right in believing so, that let's first create that independent mechanism to conduct the election, and then we can kickstart the democratic process. Is this making sense to everyone? Yeah. So you can see that while these statements are true, the alternatives that were available could have created more problems. Alternatives were even more problematic, as according to Pratap Bhanu Mehta. That's how you write an answer. Now, coming to the criticism about one-party assembly in a one-party country, Granil Boston, in his book on Indian Constitution, has said that Congress was India and India was Congress. So rather than looking at the Congress as a political party contesting for state authority, Congress was more like a coalition of multiple social movements. So the Congress was a rainbow-like coalition of multiple social movements rather than just a pure political movement to gain sovereignty and independence. So you name a social movement and you will find its manifestation in the Congress party. So you had most prominent women were on Congress platform. All the class interests were represented on the Congress platform. All the religious interests were manifested within Congress. Congress also had all the ideological influences within itself. Correct. So you had moderates, extremists coexisting with each other. For some time बंटवारा हुआ, लेकिन फिर बाद में समझ में आ गया, वापस साथ में आ गए. 1.5x speed, that's not an option that exists in live classes. You can watch recorded lectures Sakshi later on.
Your video froze.
My video froze again. What's the problem? ठंडा होने देते थोड़ा कंप्यूटर को. Let me know when I defreeze.
So the video is working.
सर आवाज नहीं आ रही. Sir, visible but not audible.
Muted. Am I audible and visible now?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. So we understood as to how Pratap Bhanu Mehta has clearly shown us that don't be moved by these criticisms. Look at the practical realities, and our founding fathers were right in not conducting elections at that point of time. Probably that was a better decision that they took. So that obviously is true. But what about these kinds of criticisms? To say that the Constitution of India is derived, copy pasted, borrowed, all these criticisms that we have read in Lakshmikant. How will you belie and how will you counter these kinds of arguments? Correct. So the one of the arguments that you should start always your answer is the statement you given by Ambedkar within the Constituent Assembly. So let's first read the entire statement and see what can be exactly quoted from that long speech that he gave, because you will not be able to write the entire thing and you will not be able to memorize that as well. So let's first see. So what he said, one likes to ask whether there can be anything new in the constitution framed at this hour in the history of the world. More than 100 years have rolled over when the first written constitution was drafted. It has been followed by many countries reducing their constitution to writing. What the scope of a constitution should be has long been settled. Similarly, what are the fundamentals of a constitution are recognized all over the world. Given these facts, all constitution in their main provisions must look similar. The only new things, if there can be any, constitution framed so late in the day are variations made to remove the faults and to accommodate it to the needs of the country. This is the line that you have to quote. As stated by Ambedkar, all constitution in their main provisions must look similar. Only thing that you can expect from a constituent assembly is to modify those foreign principles so that they fit the domestic indigenous society and its problems. And then, if the question demands, you can prove as to how the Ambedkar was right in saying it is not a borrowed constitution. It is not a copy paste. कोई कॉलेज का प्रोजेक्ट थोड़ी है. क्यों आशीष, कितना कॉपी किया कॉलेज प्रोजेक्ट में? पूरा. इतनी frankness भी अच्छी नहीं है. Okay, so you can see that while we took something x, we modified it with x plus delta x or x minus delta x, or maybe we modified x so much that it stopped looking like x. So while we were motivated by the idea of Bill of Rights, which are on the basis of individualism, we modified the individualistic idea of rights for the communitarian society. We re-engineered rights to give group rights, which was never the idea of rights on the basis of group, solidarity rights. That is not a modification, that is like a reinvention, that is a discovery. So when we were about to decide the relationship between state and religion, in no way we were motivated by the Western idea. We recreated the new secularism, and it was so different from the then understood meaning of secularism that we did not even use that word in the entire constitution, because it was not secularism. Its principles, its genesis, its context was entirely different from the Western world. It was not thought like the child of Protestantism. It was the child of Indian society, a very different understanding of secularism. So you can see, you take a principle and you show the modification. The idea of equality, how we combined the two very different principles of equality. The British understanding of color blind vision of equality and American understanding of color conscious understanding of equality. One that does not look into background realities, one that is very conscious of background realities. Equal protection of the laws. So everywhere you can see the modifications. So how can you see it as copy paste? Two good values already exist. Why should we not use them for our benefit? So you can see that the Ambedkar's point is correct. Everywhere we can see the modifications. Is this clear to everyone? Okay. Then you should go on and now start reading these, and let's explain to each other what these commentaries mean. Let's first go through the commentaries on Constitution of India. Okay. So Mr. Chaudhary says what made Indian Constitution distinctive was its self-consciously cosmopolitan character. क्या मतलब है इसका? let's say if this line is put as a question, what do you mean by this line? Or maybe the second line, the Indian constitution was about social revolution. Gautam Bhatia has called Indian constitution a transformative constitution. And this book was published just the last year, where he argues that the Indian constitution is not merely a legal document, but a transformative tool aimed at radically altering the social, economic, and political fabric of the country. Now, these are the statements that is going to become the question for 15 marks. Comment. Narayan has documented a lot of observations. Worth noting them is that the Indian constitution has been called a manifesto of social revolution, drafted with an explicit transformative agenda. It was meant to redress not just the injustices of the colonial past, but also ancient wrongs such as untouchability, the status of women, and the Hindu patriarchy. As Narayan notes, India's constitution was crafted in a self-conscious modernizing project with law seen as the primary agent of social change. Anurag Bhaskar points out that the India's founding document sparked a social revolution, weaving a social justice movements like Phule's and Ambedkar's crusades into the constitution's vision. So as if you read the Constitution of India, you don't see the text, you see Phule and Ambedkar. So when you read Article 15, Clause 3, you read Article 15, Clause 4, you read Article 16, Clause 4, you read Article 332, 33, 34, you don't see these texts, you see Phule. Shandipto Dasgupta says that the challenges of CA, Constituent Assembly, was how to carry out a revolution to avoid a revolution. If you don't cater to all forms of all axes of discrimination and deprivation, probably a revolution is imminent. It's any day now. Now, let's take 10 minutes, go through, online people go through the PPT, internalize these lines, and that's when we start breaking these lines down so that all these lines make sense to you. And we would want each and every one of you to pick up one line and explain what it means to you. Okay, so Shashwat, why don't you take Chaudhary and Austin? Anushka, Gautam Bhatia and Narayan? Chishi, Bhaskar and Dasgupta? Shubham? The first 3 lines, Shubhi, next 3 lines. Emmanuel already pasine ho gaye. Emmanuel, this whole text belongs to you. तुम लोग को कोई असाइनमेंट नहीं मिला तुम लोग चलो एक जैसे ही हैं, सिमिलर हो सकते हैं, बहुत सारों के सिमिलर मीनिंग भी हो सकते हैं, बिल्कुल हो सकते हैं, हाँ बिल्कुल हो सकते हैं, हाँ हाँ बिल्कुल, तुम्हें एक याद रहेगा, 2 याद रहेगा, एक ही पॉइंट में डिपेंड करता है क्वेश्चन कैसा है, हाँ तो उसमें 2 लोगों को रीइंफोर्स कर सकते हो ना, तो अगर सिमिलर, हाँ बिल्कुल 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 बिल्कुल, हाँ नॉट ऑल, इतना स्कोप ही नहीं रहेगा, लेकिन अगर ये कमेंट्रीज याद कर ली तो फिर कोई आंसर इस लाइन से बचेगा नहीं जो नहीं कर पाओगे, इंक्लूडिंग मतलब PYQ एज वेल एज दिस ईयर्स क्वेश्चन. बताओ आशीष, पहले दोनों बताओ. फिर ऑफलाइन वर्सेस ऑनलाइन बैटल कराएंगे. शाश्वत वर्सेस आशीष. मुझसे क्या भिड़ पाएगा?
सर अब अनम्यूट कर दो तो हम भी थोड़ा सुन ले।
क्या हुआ जीजी?
हम भी थोड़ा सुन ले सर।
लालची चीशी हो गया? आर यू डन? हाँ चलो शाश्वत, लेट्स सी द ऑफलाइन एंड ऑनलाइन बैटल स्टार्ट्स। आशीष ध्यान से सुनना। हाँ
Sir, with reference to S. Chaudhary's quote that what made Indian constitutionalism distinctive was its
you're
self-consciousness.
not audible. Can you speak a little bit louder?
Hello.
Yeah.
Sir, so with reference to S. Chaudhary's quote, we can see that in what has even been a criticism of the constitution, but as in fact a merit of it, that the Indian constitution does not derive from one single source and it is not confined to a single strand of even Indian traditional political thought or social ideology. It borrows from a myriad of streams of progressivism and thought are not restricted just to India itself, but even European thinkers. And it allows for the inclusion of every idea that the makers believed would be beneficial
Correct.
for India's progress.
Correct. And so very nicely put. And that's when, so what I was explaining to them is that if any one of these statements come as a comment or critically discussed as a 15 marker, the rest of the lines will go as the substantiating arguments. Because what you want to say has been explained by Mehta later on is what does it mean by a cosmopolitanism? It means that the Constitution of India is sitting as the cross currents of global constitutional law, which we'll see later on. So this is what cosmopolitanism is all about, that the Constitution would serve Indian needs. It would not be bound by any particular tradition. It would rather reflect and be in service of a global conversation on law and values. So the Indian nationalist movement was self-conscious about the need to transcend nationalism. So look at the broad-mindedness of our nationalist leaders, that while they were nationalists, they were equally observant about the rival political ideas. That's why the socialists could coexist with nationalists. So it was not a narrow nationalism. It was that nationalism encoded in it had the realization that nationalism or nationalist political ideology will have to take a backseat once we get the independence. That is only going to take us as far as we are not sovereign and independent. After that, the rest of the political ideas will take a front seat. So you can see that it is not a peculiar aspect of our constitution, but it is a legacy of the nationalist movement, because nationalist movement also had diverse political ideologies, in some cases even rival ones. So because it was the nationalist movement which had the cosmopolitan understanding, our constitution itself became cosmopolitan. To be free does not mean to be bound by a particular tradition or just a particular political contract. What does it mean to be free? कि नहीं मैं तो अपनी बात करूंगा, तो वो फ्री कैसे हुआ? वो तो अगेन केज्ड हो गया, वो तो शैकल्ड हो गया. What does it truly mean to be free? To be free from your own past as well. समझ में आ रहा है आशीष? To be free from your own past. Yeah. Okay. This is between me and Ashish only. Okay. The next one is Granville Austin. I think Shashwat, you took Granville
Yes, sir.
Austin?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, so with regards to social revolution, our makers were very cognizant of the reality that our nation building process is still ongoing. So the constitution that they created did not merely deal with the codification of law, but it also enshrined a vision for the future. And they focused more on substantive justice and equality and participation and democracy than just a procedural one. And this is seen in the various facets of how they deal with the
What are those provisions?
inequalities and discrepancies of our society,
What are
such
those
as
provisions,
caste.
Shashwat?
Sir, it is seen in the fundamental rights regarding untouchability and inclusion of affirmative action articles 14, 15, and 16. It is also
Correct.
seen in the directive principles of state policy. It is
Correct.
seen with regards to the right to vote, the universal adult franchise that is included, where equality is included for everyone rather than a narrow franchise, as was the case earlier. Then it is also seen in Articles 330,
Yeah,
3334.
political affirmative action. Correct.
Yes, sir.
Right. So now, if you have to put if you have to write an answer, put points on the Indian Constitution was about social revolution. Now, why can't you add these sentences? For example, it was just not to get rid of the British colonial deprivation, but also pre-colonial, ancient, and medieval ones. Correct. So it was, and then later, so that's what I'm saying, that every one of them will go into each other. So you just have to memorize them, and then your first line is done of the syllabus. Okay. Then the next one went to Anushka. Yeah. Anushka, Gautam Bhatia, transformative. What do you mean by transformative constitution?
He want to say that before the in period of the colonialism, there is a many बहुत ज़्यादा exclusion of the marginal class. There is very disparity towards the women and everyone. So he want to say by this that his main aim of the constitution main aim is to uproot the all the economical disparities of the social exclusion, and he want to make a empower the marginalized class. For example, we can take example of untouchability. uh,
Right. So, Anushka, while talking about transformative constitution, you are only focusing on social transformation, and that too very limited to the caste system. But social transformation goes into not just the caste based, but also gender based. Correct? So that is social. But then you have economic transformation, a colonial economy to a post colonial economy. It goes into political as well. This is why I've included the later line also, because not merely a legal document, but a transformative tool aimed at radically, drastically altering the social, economic, and political fabric of the country. So, universal adult franchise becomes the first pillar of political radical transformation. When people say India was not a nation, India is a state and then becomes a nation. But you can use the principle of UAF to alter that logic. Had India not been a nation, we would not have accepted universal adult franchise. Probably that was the fraternity because of which no one questioned why we are giving UAF to everyone. At least not the mainstream political thought. Never questioned this. So that shows the radical transformation of Indian society, where political equality became a norm rather than an exception. Shubhi?
So yes, sir.
Which was your line?
So it was the last three lines of this.
Of this page itself? Who took the next line, Chishi?
No, not this page, sir. The
Okay,
next
okay.
page.
Who had Narayan, Bhaskar, and Dasgupta?
Mine is Narayan.
Acha, okay. Narayan, yes.
Yeah, in this he also want to say this.
Similar things, right? So they are similar. Correct. Next line.
So Bhaskar and Dasgupta, again, they
Yeah.
talk about social revolution. I mean,
Hmm.
I mean, at this point, any opinion so late in the day will have only suitable variations, I think. But it could also be like a sort of a rebuttal to the concept of to the accusation of being it un-Indian, right? Because in
Right.
terms of it, particularly with respect to Phule and Ambedkar's crusades,
Right.
a Dalit or an
Right.
Adivasi
Excellent.
or like a homosexual's idea of what being
Correct.
Indian is would be very different from what an 80% Brahmin assembly would think, right?
Right. So what Chishi has done, Chishi has used this to counter how can it be un-Indian if it contains Phule and Ambedkar? Can you really call it an un-Indian or anti-Indian if it contains within itself Phule? So we'll use that there. Chishi, the challenge of CA was to how to carry a revolution to avoid a revolution.
So again,
What will
it
be the flow of your answer? Discuss in 15 marks.
I will talk about how the constitution is in its foundation trying to be an inclusive document so that
So
a
maybe it will be a
particular
better idea
narrow
to first talk
conception.
about the revolution first, lay down the grounds of revolution, what creates a revolution, the feeling of injustice creates the revolution, and then scrutinize and speculate all the provisions of the Constitution of India which resolve the tendencies of the society to become unjust. So because you are resolving 90% of the feeling of being unjust, you are preventing a revolution. So there are the feeling of not being fair on the basis of region. So the Constitution of India resolves that problem. Yeah. Then they're feeling on the basis of caste, region, religion, gender. The Constitution of India has enough mechanisms to respond to all of those, so that no region feels like the state is being unjust to them. That's why we have demos enabling provision in the Constitution of India, where you have the parliament unilaterally carving out a territory from other territory.
So with respect
Majority
to
at the center coming to the rescue of minority in the region, Telangana. Right? So Telangana people don't feel unjust. And after you legitimize a particular region, that region starts feeling more emboldened. So the nation gets emboldened as a result of that.
So with respect to this, we could also argue that the Constitution was ahead of its time, because most of the justifications are sort of in hindsight, right?
Are being discovered 75 years
Yeah,
down the
right,
line.
right.
Of course. The more you read about these, more you read these commentaries, more you feel proud about what they were able to achieve back then. Correct. Right. Okay. Next.
Yes.
Locating Indian constitutionalism, India's constitution was a framework through which the world's largest and one of the most contentious democracies were brought into being. Unlike other countries where revolution led to formation of the constitution, Indian constitution itself is revolutionary. Very similar to the comment where the idea was not to give rise to a revolution. It was the charter through which an ancient civilization was set on the path to modernity. Who had taken this line?
Sir, me.
Shobham, you had not taken that line. You were given these lines.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. So what is the meaning of this line? It was set on the road to modernity. What does modernity means to you?
Sir, in my sense, sir, we can explain this line with an example of Indian form of secularism. As Indian form of secularism is a reformative one rather than a watertight compartment like the West. So, sir, the ancient orthodoxical elements, our constitution is giving a way to reform the orthodoxial elements into the modernity,
Correct.
like, sir, untouchability and the positive discrimination provisions in the constitution.
Right. Correct. So you can see that when you break these lines down, they probably result in the same breakdown. India was finding a way to resolve major substantive debates and disputes over norms and values. Who is going to break this down? Sakshi?
So it was mine.
Acha, Shubhi,
No,
please.
I don't want to break it down. I have something else to say. Can I?
Yeah, Shubhi, if it was allocated to you, can you speak about this line?
Yes, sir. So the way I understood it, that we have we wanted to resolve different disputes and debates that were arising in our own country related to the norms and values. Like we used to go back and refer to the preamble when it comes to resolving any kind of debate or the dispute. If these parts of if there's any debate, for example,
Shishi control.
like for example, when there was a debate regarding if the development should be if when there was a dispute between DPSPs and FRs, so we did refer to a preamble to that we have to give primacy to DPSP first, and coming up with a fine balance between both DPSPs and FRs.
Yeah, correct. No, so the conflict between DPSP and FR is for later one. What these three authors together, the most prominent authors in Indian constitutional law and political philosophy in modern times, what they want to say is that you should not look at the Constitution of India as a just like a supreme law of the land. It is a conflict resolutory document. It is a document which is made to resolve the conflicts.
So
And they have
can we refer to the judicial review and the basic structure? Like,
no, you can't. Let's first discuss it. So the notes that I have included later on talk about this. Basically, if you look at the Constitution of India, it has become a touchstone which every side of a political debate vows by. मैं संविधान की कसम खा के कहता हूं. So in the rest of the world, what happens is that the constitutional crisis becomes a societal crisis. Look at what has happened in Nepal. A problem in the constitution fragmented the society. What has happened in Sri Lanka, 13th constitutional amendment, still beyond resolution. So it is generally the changes in the constitution or the provisions of the constitution which create problem on the ground. The beauty of the Constitution of India is that any social, political, or economic debate eventually becomes a constitutional debate. Both the sides to the debate put forward across their idea as my idea is more supported by the Constitution. My interpretation of the article is better as compared to yours. So when people were critiquing EWS, they were either talking about social and educationally backward classes, SC, ST will not extend to economic, and other people were saying, look at how the Constitution of India takes care of hitherto unorganized, invisible people. When they become visible, the Constitution of India comes to their rescue. Both sides trying to prove that their side is strong because the Constitution supports their side. So if a text eventually is able to cater to all the disputes, nothing can be better for the society. This is what it wants to say. It is a document which resolves the dispute. Khosla ka statement. Is this clear to everyone? All right. Emmanuel.
Yes, sir.
Bata.
So, sir, our constitution makers, they had a like broad view of the world, and so they realized ki why not take the the good from all the cultures and countries and not bind ourselves to our own Indian values and traditions. And hence we took the idea of liberty, equality, fraternity from the French Revolution, DPSPs from Ireland, FRs came from the Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
And then this transcend nationalism. So like it means that we need to move beyond our the limitations and negative aspects which are like linked to national identity and aim for a broader perspective like
Right.
global citizenship or like
Correct.
universal
So
human rights.
now quickly summarize the last line.
Its takes and principles, its values and its and so here is many last follow.
Last line समझ में नहीं आई? Okay. Sakshi,
Yes,
can you
sir.
explain the last line? And you can ask the doubt as well.
So it's giving reference to the major global judicial traditions such as due process of law that we have incorporated over time.
Sakshi, you're not audible. Okay. You're not audible. So this is the most prominent line that we have done so far, which will be relevant when we will talk about judicial activism, when we will talk about widening of fundamental rights. This is the line that has to be reproduced. According to Pratap Bhanu Mehta, India's constitution is sitting at the cross current of global constitutional law. What is a cross current? In geography, you have read about cross currents as areas where warm and cold currents meet. And these are the most fertile regions in oceans, correct? Because of the high nutrient supply, better oxygen, and so they are the areas where the diversity is much more high, and they become the fishing grounds for the people, right? What Pratap Bhanu Mehta says is that when the constitution was being written down, it was situated at the cross current, which meant that whatever best that was that existed at that point of time was already incorporated in the Indian constitution. And because of which, even the future Indian jurisprudence has continued with this tendency to be always situated on global cross currents. That is why judiciary flawlessly quotes American Supreme Court judgment. That's why even the Indian domestic law always makes sure that the best international law, whether in the field of environmentalism, whether in the field of human rights, automatically flawlessly gets incorporated into municipal law or domestic law. It is because of the constitution always being situated on the global cross currents of global constitutional law. Is this making sense to everyone? Nissan mein Ashish? मल्टीपल आइडियोलॉजीज के बीच में डिबेट चल रहा है, लेकिन आप उससे एक्सपोज्ड हो कि नहीं? आपका वो विजन नैरो है कि खुला हुआ है कि मैं ये भी सुनूंगा, वो भी सुनूंगा, वो भी सुनूंगा, मैं यूएस कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन के जजमेंट भी पढ़ूंगा, मैं ब्रिटिश इनफैक्ट यू वुड शुड नॉट बी सरप्राइज्ड दैट इंडियन सुप्रीम कोर्ट हैज कोटेड पाकिस्तान सुप्रीम कोर्ट जजमेंट ऑन वेरियस ओकेजन्स. दैट इज द लेवल दैट वी आर ब्रॉड माइंडेड. तुम सोचो, राइट? सो वी आर नॉट बाउंड बाय एनी पर्टिकुलर ट्रेडिशन. दुश्मनी होगी हमारी, जजेस की नहीं है. अगर उन्होंने कोई अच्छी बात लाहौर हाईकोर्ट ने बोली तो हम क्यों ना लें उस चीज को? सोसाइटी तो सेम ही है, तो अगर उन्होंने कोई मस्त बात बोल दी तो हम लेंगे उसको भाई. ठीक है? Article 3 से how are you going to link Article 368 in it? Of course we can incorporate best provisions. Yes. Okay. So so this is the final take that you should read. This is like a summary of all the texts that we have read so far.
Sir,
Yes, Sakshi.
am I audible now?
Yes, we can try. There is some problem with both your audio as well as our speaker.
I just wanted to say that we are time and again emphasizing the fact that we are like from an ancient civilization moving towards modernity, right?
Right.
And we are
Right.
saying that we are taking up these values of modernity, democracy, like liberty, equality, all of them from West. But we can also bring another perspective, as Amartya Sen has argued this in his book Argumentative India, that we are not doing something new. This was there in our own ancient traditions. So democracy is not something which we have borrowed, but we are reviving them. So this can also be another perspective from
That can be a perspective, but I personally do not agree to this idea that these values, all the modernity existed in our ancient traditions. That is a very particular political ideology which make people believe. Amar Sen does not belongs to that, but to derive pride in the fact that most of the things can be sourced back to India's ancient tradition is a wrong understanding of modernity itself. So either you are misunderstanding the present or you are misreading the past. There is either one of the case. Okay, so ultimately it is continuity with change. The inclusive deliberative nature of the Constituent Assembly and comparative inspiration ensured that the Constitution was syncretic and eclectic, not a British clone. Can be used as a line. Let's now move on to the next topic. Diverse social and political perspectives in constitution making. So when the constitution was being debated, there was a lot of debate with respect to every provision. So for example, should there be rights or should there be duties? There was a debate about that, because the way you choose your provision as enforceable will define the character of your state, correct? Then whether it should be federal or whether it should be unitary, if it should be federal, to what extent we should decentralize the power was the question. Then when the state is going to look at the religion, what will be that look? Will that be no look, like a blindness of each other, like a iron curtain between the church and the state? Or will it be open hearted acceptance of one of the religion, as was done in all the countries surrounding India? Correct. So all the countries in India, around India, have a state religion, and so obviously the question was how to go about it. At that point of time, the relationship between Tibet and China was not very clear, but China also has closely accepted religion by making sure there is no religion. So that is love and extreme hate. So you cannot really distinguish between them. Correct. So in that sense, China's obsession with religion is no different from Pakistan's obsession for religion. Correct. So we had multiple models available, and there was obviously there had to be a debate about it. So let's look at all the discourses, major debates, and look at the people, different perspectives. We know which one we went ahead with. Basically, whatever Nehru and Ambedkar and Patel wanted, they managed their way through their own ideas. So nature of democracy, whether it should be a parliamentary democracy where the people will be ruled by representatives with centralized authority, or whether it will be village republics, was the idea of Gandhi. So modernists like Nehru and Ambedkar preferred parliamentary democracy, whereas Gandhians were demanding Panchayati Raj. We know what has happened. We went with the Nehru and Ambedkar. When it comes to federal structure, there was contention between advocates of a strong central government and those favoring a loose federation of states. Members of Hindu Mahasabha and others wanted more autonomy for provinces. Why do you think that is the case? Why do you think Hindu Mahasabha people would want decentralization rather than centralization, more autonomy for provinces? To make country as a nation? रिलीजन के बेसिस पे ऑटोनॉमी तो नहीं मिलेगी, लेकिन so have you ever felt that the systems and the processes at the central government level are far standardized and better as compared to the process at the local level? Because at the local level, the scrutiny is very low. Whether it is civic society scrutiny, whether it is media scrutiny, whether there are other checks and balances. So if you belong to for example, religion-based political ideology or religion-heavy political ideology, it is better that you will be able to force your ideas better if the power is distributed at the local level. Does that make sense to everyone? The scrutiny at the national level is high. If all the power is located at the national level, it will take 65 years for you to come to power. Right? Okay. Then the result was a highly centralized federation, often termed as quasi-federal, with Patel's view. Then you have fundamental rights versus social policy. The conflict was what to be made as enforceable and what to be put in an unenforceable section, or whether there should be a difference between them, which we will delve into later, part 3 and part 4. There was a widespread debate about how aggressively to safeguard individual rights as opposed to steering the state towards social revolution. Because social revolution, transformation. So obviously there had to be a debate. Most transformative provisions were made unenforceable, correct? So the most protracted debate centered around the right to property and the enforceability of DPSPs. Socialist aligned members were numerous. N.G. Ranga, Jaipal Singh, even Ambedkar desired assured socioeconomic rights contained in Part 4 of the Constitution, advocating directive principles be made justiciable. They warned that it left non-justiciable DPSPs would be nothing more than a pious declaration, veritable dustbin of sentiments. All these criticisms that we'll see in DPSPs, ये कुछ नहीं है, बस एक डस्टबिन है जहां बढ़िया बढ़िया चीजें फेंक दी गई और रैंडमली, जस्ट लाइक डस्टबिन में आप रैंडमली फेंकते हो ना, कोई ऑर्डर नहीं होता है, एक लिबरल फेंका, फिर एक सोशलिस्ट फेंका, फिर एक गांधीयन फेंक दिया, फिर एक लिबरल फेंक दिया. In the end, a compromise was reached. Essential rights, civic and political, were made enforceable in court, but socio-economic directives were made non-justiciable but constitutionally directive. The makers of the constitution were very conscious in choosing the words. They titled part 3 as fundamental rights, and when they began part 4, it said they shall not be enforceable but fundamental in the governance, making sure that while you cannot violate FR, while not violating FR, you always be directed towards part 4. The only two places where the word fundamental has been used in the entire constitution. So it was less a legal compelling reason, it was more a moral compass to always guide whoever is in power. क्या हो गया चिशी, क्या सोच रहा है? डे ड्रीमिंग चालू हो गई क्या तेरी?
Major.
You were lost.
No, I was
Okay.
reflecting.
Minority representation, separate electorates versus a unified nation. So, for example, uniform civil code, something that is relevant and very important for this year's mains, which we'll deal in DPSP. The assembly was divided on whether it should impose a uniform civil law for everybody. So you can see that uniform civil code is less a matter of secularism, it is more a matter of sovereignty, correct? So never in PSIR paper confuse the essential guiding principle of UCC, correct? It is about internal supremacy. What governs the relationship between two different individuals, whether it is a civic municipal law or it is a traditional religious law. The fact that immense human dimensions are being regulated not by the parliamentary or legislative assembly laws, but by traditional laws rooted in custom shows that India's state is not yet sovereign. Correct. So in West, UCC is a result of the debate of sovereignty. Who should govern or who should regulate the relationship? In criminal matters, parliamentary law. In civil matters, parliamentary law. In India, criminal matters, parliamentary law. Civil matters, largely made by parliament. For example, contract, agreement, financial matters, all these are civic laws, but made by parliament, except a very small subset of civic laws, personal laws, which deal with very specific 5 matters. Marriage, divorce, inheritance, adoption is dealt by the religion based laws, correct? So obviously there was a debate as to whether we should immediately make it binding on all the people. So assembly was divided whether it should impose a UCC for everybody. Minority groups members, they were not in favor, obviously. Judiciary and separation of power. Ambedkar strongly opposed a notion of imperium in imperio and state within a state. No one literally reappoints themselves in the world except for Indian judiciary and King Jong-un family. Correct. So you can see that this should go as the first criticism of judicial appointment in India. Something that was discussed and rejected by Ambedkar, how can it become a norm 30 years down the line? So Ambedkar said that yes, we considered this option, whether the judiciary will appoint itself, but we are rejecting it because we do not want to create a state within a state. What it means is that so one nation should have one law, one principle. And that one principle is you cannot be appointed by yourself. So the outgoing person will not appoint there as far as the state authority is concerned. So these were the different perspectives. Contemporary reflections, why we are taking this is because of Vivek Debroy's random commentary, which was later on, which had to be denied by Prime Minister's office, is that incremental amendments are not enough and we should draft a new constitution. Vivek Debroy is an influential person and it created a lot of flutter, which gave opportunity to the rest of the scholars to start writing editorial. So do you agree we should draft a new constitution? Every year, every 2 years, we keep on amending the constitution. Sorry.
So this was already rejected by the NCRWC, right?
So, but that was rejected 25 years ago. So why do you think he talked about a new constitution? What was the need to have a new constitution? What is the thought process behind this commentary that minor changes, incremental changes, rather than that, let's outrightly rewrite the constitution?
There is a revival of revivalist ideas that the constitution is not Indian enough.
Ashwat, use your mic.
Sir, there is a revival of the revivalist sentiment that the constitution is not Indian enough and that it has been made in a specific vision. Like, for instance, there is particular criticism of the sovereign and socialist, sorry, the secular and socialist
Yeah,
nature
correct.
of the
That's
constitution.
in preamble. Yeah. Right. So, do you think that the Constitution of India, as of now in 2025, is unable to cater to the present needs of the society? Or going forward, you see issues in the existing text? It is the constitution which has provided for LGBTQ rights. So what do you need in LGBTQ rights except for marriage, which is a social aspect? The legal and political aspects have been taken care of by Article 14, 19, and 21. You have the right to self-identify, and you, as in people, have the right to self-identify themselves. People have the homosexuality has been decriminalized in our country. So what else, whatever else that the people need cannot be provided by the constitution. Yes, Sakshi. So it is a living document, and because it is a living document, it has, just like a living organism or a living species, it has adopted with time. It has evolved with time. How has it evolved with time? It has evolved with time because of constitutional amendments. So various significant constitutional amendments have happened, starting from the first constitutional amendment to the latest 106th Constitutional Amendment Act. So various important provisions of the constitutions have been changed. Various radical provisions have been introduced in the Constitution of India. That is one way. The constitution evolves also through judicial interpretation. So largely the ambit of rights that we are able to enjoy now is because of the judicial activism. So isn't it the modification of the constitution itself? It's just not the text. How it gets implemented on the ground also is an evolution of the constitution itself. So only when you look different will I call you have changed, or the way you talk, the way you walk, and the way you think, if that changes, also changes you. So just because the text changes through a constitutional amendments does not mean the constitution doesn't evolve in multifarious ways. So that is the second one. Third one is the constitution also changes because of the laws. We think laws change because of the constitution, but the implementation of the constitution is done on the bridges of laws. So if the constitution under Article 17 makes untouchability a punishable criminal offense, until the point we had Civic Rights Act, or until the point we have Prevention of Atrocities Against SC/ST Act, it was a dead letter. So what activates a provision in the constitution is the laws. And so when more and more laws are created and more effective laws are created, that's what evolves a constitution for us. Does it make sense to everyone?
Sir, regarding this thing, isn't it sort of true that those advocating for a new constitution or a changed system are looking more towards having leaning more towards an exclusionary principle, whereas our
Rather than
constitution has
inclusionary
evolved
principle.
on inclusive lines.
Right. Correct.
Right, because the
But
whole
you
debate
can't
on
write,
secular and
you can't
socialist
write that in the answer sheet. You can't say that the people who are demanding, like Vivek Devroy, they are being driven by a very narrow exclusionary vision of society. You can't write that. तो
Sir,
अपना
but
गुस्सा
how
अंदर पी
else?
के
Sir, but how else do we spin this socialist and secular angle or the preamble thing? That
no, so that is different. So when people say that, is the word socialist in preamble relevant in 2025, there are credible reasons to believe that. You can't say that criticism or that commentary is as bad as this commentary. No, that is not. How far socialism is relevant in 2025 is different from saying we need a new constitution. Yeah. Correct. So even a new constitution would need changes. So that has to be a living document as well. And also the biggest point that can go against is that there is no problem that the Indian society is facing as of now, economy is facing as of now, politics is facing as of now, which the constitution is not capable of responding to. Right? Demand for changing the constitution is not coming from the people. So they are the people. They are a part of the people, right? You can't say they are not. इसने तो citizenship ही ले ली इन लोगों की. There will be a crisis of legitimacy too for any new constituent assembly. Correct. All right. So please go through these commentaries. And the idea is to write the PYQs that have been asked from this line of the syllabus and see whether we are able to write all the answers. Send it on the group and I will give feedbacks. Okay. So write all these PYQs of IGP. If you do not have time, you can break it down maybe in 2-3 lines. You can just say what you would say, just like briefly, like making passing remarks कि मैं पहले ये बोलता फिर ये बोलता खत्म. Rather than spending 10 minutes on each answer, you can spend 2 minutes on each answer. But I genuinely want you to break down these questions. If you are able to answer them after reading the PPTs, my job is done. So every Friday we would take IGP classes, and then on Saturday and Sunday, Rahul sir, non-IGP. So PSIR को मैं ऐसे ही बोलता हूँ, IGP and non-IGP. All right then.